Welcome everyone to our afternoon workshop session, Effective Teaming, Collaboration, Trust, and Leveraging Diversity with Dr. Catherine Ciano. My name is Maya Compton, and I will be your moderator for today's session. Again, thank you for joining us. With that being said, I am so happy to introduce you to our presenter today, Dr. Catherine Ciano, who is a psychologist with the University Health Center here at UC Berkeley. She's also a teaming strategist where she helps people build skills to transform their teams and work better through training and supportive community. So everyone give a nice little blue round of applause for Dr. Ciano. We're very excited to have you.
Thank you very, very much, Maya. And I am very excited to be here and that you all are here joining us today. So I'd like to start by orienting us to what to expect from the presentation. Firstly, I am thinking of you as participants, not necessarily as leaders, but as members of teams. And so when we're talking about utilizing some of these skills, it's as a team member on your team. And then the second way I'd like to orient you is to think about what we're going to talk about as, you can think about certain skills in terms of the cognitive skills or behavioral skills. I'm approaching it more from an experiential component. So those are the parts I'm going to be pulling out today. And another way to think about it is you have components of processes or outcomes. So sometimes we talk about an outcome of something a lot, but what I really want to delve into more is the process of things and the process of teaming. So that's why I'm using the word teaming, which is a verb, not team. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. So today's agenda, I'm going to start off talking to you about what my goal is for you today. And then I'm going to share a little bit about my journey and how I got interested in teaming and effective teaming. Then, as the name implies, we're going to talk about collaboration, trust, and leveraging diversity. During the trust portions is when I'm going to really engage you all and ask you to participate in some of the thinking exercises. But then also I would love for a few of you to volunteer, and we'd love to kind of hear what your thinking and your perspectives on some of those topics are. And then finally, we'll do some skill building and question and answers. I'd like to save about maybe 15 minutes for the Q&A because I found last year we ran out of time. So I really want to hear from you and kind of be able to answer questions and apply what we learn and talk about today directly. So today's goal is hope. And what is hope? Well, to have hope, you actually need to have it in something. So you're going to have some kind of goal, something in the future that you're looking forward to. So applying it today, it's the hope that you will have skills to improve effectiveness on your team and feel confident in utilizing those skills. The second part is having the determination to start and to be able to sustain. So with what you'll learn today, I want you to feel like you're able to start moving in that direction of improving the effectiveness on your team. And then finally, the belief in your ability to overcome or navigate any type of obstacles that you may encounter as you're kind of moving towards this goal or this new place. So that's where I want you to be, and that's how I want you to feel, and having that kind of hope by the end of today's presentation. My journey. So while I can talk a lot about myself and a lot about my experiences, I'm actually going to read my journey because there are important parts of it that I don't want to leave any out. So I'm going to start by letting you know that I didn't like how I felt after participating in team meetings. I expressed myself more in passion than I wanted and didn't particularly feel understood. To resolve this, I would say to myself at the beginning of the next meeting, you're not going to say anything. Yet every time I would end up saying something, though not as clearly articulated as I would have liked. As I started being more mindful of my experience, I accepted a few things. First, I said to myself, you're not meant to be quiet. It's not how you were created. And second, emotions aren't meant to be suppressed. They're meant to be understood to guide effective action. Out of those realizations, I became very intentional with how I engage with my own internal experience and utilize those experiences to guide ways to engage with my team most effectively. In business school, I took my new learnings about courageously speaking up and applied them in one of my teams. Needless to say, as a psychologist in business school, I was a fish out of water. Still, I believed in what I preached and I felt compelled to practice it. My team was very diverse. We all knew it and saw it as a strength. And even though my team members provided messaging that everyone should feel comfortable to speak up, our meetings ran with a sense of urgency for the sake of efficiency and getting an A. There was little time to think or discuss. Needless to say, we were not leveraging our strengths of diversity. Very frustrated, I reflected on my choices. I could do what I had done many times, acknowledge that some battles just aren't worth fighting, and choose to disengage. What that would mean is that they would get 60% of my effort, and what I could uniquely contribute would not be offered to this team. Or I could put my energies toward applying everything I'd learned over the years about humans and facilitating change. I didn't yet know business, but I knew people. I knew I had something very valuable that the team needed. Therefore, I chose to be a change enabler. It required work and way more emotional energy than I planned to give to business school, but it was worth it. I saw increased respect for each other's strengths, improved processes and workflow, and even changes in our behaviors. So for example, changing from a focus of efficiency to effectiveness. I share this story today because I recognize a need and an opportunity of leveraging diversity. Diversity is a beautiful thing and it can produce beautiful things for teams and businesses, but just putting people that are very different from each other together is not enough. It's very important for us to know how to work with people that are different from ourselves and to really leverage the beauty of diversity. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start off with a poll, and I would just like to kind of get a sense of where people are and how they're feeling about diversity on their own teams, and then also about your ability to affect change on your teams. So Maya's going to assist me with issuing the first question, which is around my team leverages team member diversity. In just a few more seconds. Okay, so I will have Maya go ahead and share out the results. And all right, so sometimes it's what wins at 36%. The great news is only 4% said never, so that's a good thing. And okay, so we've got 27% at absolutely. Okay, so what this means is that there's room for growth, room for improvement, but it's not something that people are not aware of or that teams are not aware of completely. And then I'll have Maya go ahead and do the second question. All right, just a few more seconds. Okay, so I'll ask Maya to go ahead and share out these results. And same kind of thing where I'm grateful that very few really feel like never. But again, hopefully we can go ahead and improve that today. Most say sometimes. We're at 46% there, and absolutely we're at 24%. So I am looking to get most of us up to, absolutely by the end of this talk, and at least feeling capable and knowing what you can do and what you can do differently to help improve that. All right, so we can go ahead and stop sharing, Maya, and I'll continue. Thank you all for participating in that. All right, so we're going to start off by talking about collaboration. And this is something I've listened to a couple of talks today, so this is a theme of today. So we're going to learn a lot about collaboration. Collaboration can be thought about in two ways. So again, as I started at the beginning, I mentioned to you process and outcome. So as a process, we're looking at the behaviors of team members. We're looking at how they communicate, a willingness to be open and trust in their teammates, and how they deal with conflict. So dealing with it in a more supportive manner in contrast with it being more authoritative. As an outcome, collaboration is more collective intelligence. So it works more like a system where the parts and the pieces are working together in tandem and in a dynamic fashion, producing an excellent outcome. So you can think about it like when we talk about systems, you can think about like your body, for example, how there's so many different parts and different components, and they balance each other out, and they're always kind of in constant communication. Those are the two ways collaboration can be thought about. And we're contrasting it with other types of team processes, such as team building. So with collaboration, it's a richer process. It involves the creation of value. And it's when team members realize that they cannot do it by themselves and begin to accept and respect the insights, questions, and ideas from others that collaboration really begins to occur. When you do have collaboration occurring in a unit or on a team, it produces excellent results. For example, teams that are collaborative are more innovative, productive, and more satisfied than teams that do not collaborate. So then you might beg to ask, well, then why isn't everyone doing it if collaboration is so wonderful and produces such great outcomes? Great question. Psychological safety, look at that, another theme of today's conference. So when you don't have psychological safety on a team, you're not going to really get that collaboration. What psychological safety is a climate that's on a team, and that climate is that people feel like it's safe for interpersonal risk-taking. What's really important about psychological safety on a team is it's talking about the team as a unit. So not necessarily the individuals, but all the members of the team are feeling safety there. If you're okay asking for help, giving feedback, you're not punished if you make a mistake, and it's assumed that you had good intentions in whatever actions that you did. People can be themselves. And the other important component is if you have psychological safety, you're not using that energy for self-protection or to protect yourself, but you can instead direct that energy towards collaborating and really being a part of that unit. Psychological safety is facilitated by trust. So we have a couple of components here. We've got collaboration at the top. In order to have collaboration, we need psychological safety. And in order to have psychological safety, we need trust. Next, we're going to go ahead and talk about trust. The definition of trust is the willingness to be vulnerable to someone whom you rely on to deliver something important, regardless of the amount of power or ability to monitor or control that person. So we're at our first discussion where we're going to talk a little bit more about trust. So here are some statements about trust as it relates to teams. And what I'd like you to do is read through these statements and think about it. Think about what it is that you believe to be true with these statements. And, you know, it's not about there being a right or wrong answer, but just kind of, think about your experience and, what you've seen, what you understand, what you've noticed, maybe even something that you've read. And then after you take a few moments to think about it, I would like a couple of people to volunteer to share out. So I'll give you maybe about 45 seconds to a minute just to read through these and think about it. And then I'll have a few of you share. Okay, so let's go ahead and start our discussion portion. And in addition to you talking about what you believe to be true, I'd also like for you to share why you believe it to be true. So you can just choose one that you'd like to talk about. And if you're okay volunteering and sharing, let me have you go ahead and raise your little blue hand, and Maya's going to select someone to go ahead and share with us.
Hi. My name's Helen. I just wanted to speak to the second one, that building trust must take time. And I feel like this is true if there have already been negative experiences. But I can say that being fairly new to my team, that there are people who have been every experience I've had with them have already like instigated so much trust and so much openness that after one meeting, I felt like this is someone I can trust, and this is someone who, we can help change the world. And, so I feel like this can be true if you're trying to overcome, maybe something that already happened, but when you're starting with a fresh slate, maybe not.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Helen, for sharing. Others that are okay sharing.
Hi, I'm Darnell, and I'd like to talk about the first one. It's the team's leader job to create a team culture of trust. I think that in all aspects, that's what a leader does, is create the right type of environment so that people feel comfortable sharing their thoughts and coming up and being creative. So.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing. That's absolutely wonderful. And as I started researching this, I saw a lot of language and literature and everything directed towards the leaders, putting a lot of responsibility on leaders to create that culture of trust. How about one more?
Looks like that's all we have.
Wow. Okay. Well, we will move on. I just thought I'd have so many blue hands. No worries. We're going to have 2 more times. So if you didn't get to this time, please, I encourage you next time. Okay. So the last one, so I'm going to go through a little bit more about trust. The last one I do want to kind of comment on is the last one about I cannot control other people on my team, because part of what I'm saying is I'm going to give you some tools or some, tips to influence and change your team's culture. And so while it's true that you really can't control other people, what we can do is we can influence cultures, and we can engage in behaviors that will increase the chance that someone else will do whatever the other behavior is that we're looking for. So things can change even though it's not a direct control of another person. Okay, so in terms of trust, we have a couple different types of trust, and I think Helen, the first person that shared out, spoke a little bit to swift trust. So what happens sometimes is when you have a team, and maybe it's, a team that's being brought together just for a project. So these are people that don't know each other, and maybe they don't even have time to get to know each other. Sometimes you are dealing with distributed teams where you're working globally on a project, and you have to kind of get comfortable enough and have enough trust to start moving things forward. So with swift trust, there is no prior knowledge of the other person, and you're needing to develop some level of trust right away to begin working. So the way this happens is people tend to import trust from other situations. And one of those examples is category-based trust. So what category-based trust is people will put others into categories, kind of mentally they'll put people into categories. Sometimes it's happening on a conscious level, sometimes it's an unconscious level, but then you're going to go ahead and gauge your level of trust based on the experiences that you've had with working with someone in that category. So those categories can be based on gender, it can be based on other cultural factors. It can be based on arbitrary groups or arbitrary categories, such as, different maybe groups that people just put in, or even just different colors of someone's shirt. So there's a range in terms of how we might group people into categories. And what happens is as you get to know someone and you develop a history and knowledge, then trust kind of changes into knowledge-based trust. Even though the change happens and knowledge-based trust tends to be a more accurate prediction for people, sometimes there are those residual parts of the swift trust that are held on to throughout the relationship. So with knowledge-based trust, if you're getting to know the person, you're evaluating your ability to trust that person based on their integrity, their ability, and benevolence. So integrity is that person going to do what they say they're going to do? Ability, do they even have the capacity to deliver or do those things? And then benevolence is, do they want to do good things for other people? And I think about these 3 components a little bit like the sliders that you'll see with the RGB color scale where you have like the 3 little components and you can slide them up and down. So that's how it works with these three areas, is they can kind of be at different degrees. And of course, the higher they are, then that would be the more propensity to trust someone on those areas. Other components of trust are perceived risk. So how risky you think it might be. There's like trade-offs. When you're dealing with distributed work or remote working, that tends to be perceived as riskier because there's more uncertainty than if you're, with someone face-to-face working with them in person. Disposition to trust refers to just a person's tendency, how trusting they tend to be as a person. So some people just have a disposition to not really be quick to trust people, or not really trust people, where other people might be very quick to trust people. And that's informed by our past experiences. So experiences of promises that were kept versus promises that were broken. It's also informed by early childhood experiences from our parents in terms of what they modeled for us and what that relationship was like. So that's what informs a person's disposition to trust. And that it plays a role as we're trusting other people in our teams. And then finally, in-group bias. So people, I was talking about how we sometimes can group people or group ourselves. And, if we're identifying with others, we'll see ourselves as more similar to those people. And then there's a tendency to trust people more when you see yourself as more similar to them. On teams, we can see how this can be challenging if you have multiple team members and maybe you see yourself similar as multiple team members, so you're trusting those team members, but then maybe a different team member who might be seen as outside of the group. That can be very challenging in that you're all on the same team working in the same direction, but yet there's the varying levels of trust. And then we're going to move on to the final category, which is leveraging diversity. And let me just make a note. If within the questions that I asked you to think about and we discussed, if when I went through a little bit more detail about trust, if some of those weren't answered, or you just kind of would love a little bit more clarity, feel free to throw that in the chat box and I can always elaborate if you would like me to. So leveraging diversity. We'll go ahead and define what we mean by diversity. So we're pretty much just talking about the different qualities, characteristics, experiences, abilities, backgrounds of individuals. And we're appreciating, respecting the variety of attributes. We're not just talking about race or ethnicity. And typically, we're looking to have the diverse group represent the community. Sometimes you'll hear language around like the proportion, is it in proportion to the representation that's within the community? Another term I'd like to share in relation to leveraging diversity is cultural competence. So again, this is something that I've seen in other presentations today. We're going to delve into this a little bit more, but pretty much what we're doing with cultural competence is we're building a knowledge or skills in a couple of different areas. So first, we're starting with ourselves and we're looking at our own worldviews and our own attitudes towards differences. And then we're looking at others, so their cultural practices and their worldviews. And then finally, it's going to translate into our behavior, how we're applying that as we're relating to people that are different from ourselves. And with those two definitions, that's going to lead us into our second discussion around leveraging diversity. So it's going to be the same thing as before. I'm going to give you a couple of statements. I want you to think about it. And then I would love to have a couple of volunteers share out with us, please. With these, I am using cultural and community kind of simultaneously, or to mean the same thing here. And I'm going to just read through them. So studying cultural community norms is the best way to learn about other cultures and communities. Diversity within teams improves team performance. And conflict on teams is good. So think about what you believe to be true and why. Give you a few moments. Okay, so we will start the discussion, and I appreciated our 2 volunteers from our first round, so hopefully they inspired more volunteers this time. And then Maya, whenever you're ready, feel free to go ahead and unmute someone who's raised their blue hands through the participants button.
I would just say that with the second comment, diversity within teams improves team performance. I completely agree with this. I think that it's one of those things where if you have different backgrounds, different experiences, different, obviously diversity, it brings more to the table. If everyone in the group has the same ideas, same backgrounds, same knowledge and experience, you're going to just have the same thing over and over. And we all know that doing the same thing over and over isn't going to lead to anything new, isn't going to lead to outside the box ideas. But if you have a big diverse group and you will learn things from each other, and your ideas and experience might then, like a puzzle, come together with other pieces and form this amazing picture. And you might just have in your mind the sky, but someone else has the sun and the ocean, and next thing you know, you've created this amazing new thing that you didn't think happened. Without all that background and different differences, you just wouldn't come up with that picture. You just have the sky.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think you definitely highlight the beauty of diversity and the capacity that diversity really can bring when it's leveraged. Yeah. Others.
Hi, this is Siobhan Harris. I was actually just thinking that on the same point, I would say it's actually conditional, because diversity will only improve the team performance if you let it. You can have all of these wonderful resources and perspectives and skills, but if people aren't willing to learn from each other or to observe each other, it's kind of moot. So I think that you need to be really willing to You need to lean into diversity if you're going to have it bring the value that it really could.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I remember having someone share about how, whenever one of their friends would change jobs, they would hire people from their previous teams because they had worked with them before and they knew each other and they could move pretty quickly. And there are some strengths for sure when you all know each other and you think similarly, but at the same time, you can miss out on a lot. And so there's something to be said about when you have the differences, there is a learning component that's in play, and learning how to really work with each other and how to work with people that are different than you. So yeah, you definitely bring up an excellent point in that there has to be a willingness to really, get the aspects of diversity and the benefits of diversity. Yeah. I would love to hear from one more if we've got anyone.
Hi, my name is Carmen. Thank you for letting me share. I want to touch on the third point. Conflict on teams is good. And I share the sentiment of the person just before me that it's conditional. I think that conflict is good. If it doesn't take it to a level where people become disagreeable, if people can keep it on a level where we can agree to disagree, your idea, you have this idea, we have this idea, but if we're going to go forward, we're going to have to either mesh those ideas or find a new idea. So conflict can sort of push your limit in a sense of it makes you look within yourself and look at your motives. What are my motives and what's the goal of the team? So when we look at what's the goal of the team, conflict can be good because we can look at ourselves, assess the situation, and then try to find some resolution. Conflict is not good when people decide to hold their position and they're unyielding.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that. And so one of the things you're kind of bringing out is that it's not a black and white thing. It's not sometimes I'll use technical terms like 0 and 1s for the engineers in the room, but it's not a 0 and 1 kind of thing. So it kind of depends. And so what that means is, sometimes individuals will try to keep the peace and avoid conflict. And especially when you have diversity, it's okay to have some kind of conflict. We're not going to see eye to eye. And that's, again, the beauty of it. And at the same time, how are we relating to this conflict, and how are we, maneuvering and keeping things moving forward, not necessarily coming to stalemates or the conflict escalating into something that's unhelpful and unproductive. So yeah, that's absolutely correct. Okay, go ahead and move on. So, before I gave you the definition of cultural competence, and that's very common in a lot of disciplines where this is what you're learning, this is the goal is, what the goal is. And with competence, we're identifying the problem to be a lack of knowledge, and so therefore the focus is on developing that knowledge, the skills, and the behaviors that are needed to, become competent. Where I'd like to kind of move us towards is cultural humility. And cultural humility is more of a process than an outcome. So you never really arrive, but it is that lifelong process where you're engaging yourself in the process, and you're understanding yourself and your own experiences. It has a little bit more of a reflective component, and you're thinking about how that's relating to the other person, or how that relates to people that are different than yourself. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but we'll go through it now, but then even at the end, we're going to have some more components that I'm going to bring the cultural humility part in more. This is a table. This is not in the original slides that you may have downloaded online from online, but I wanted to share it because I think it provides a nice comparison of the other components and ways that cultural competence and cultural humility differ. What I'd like to highlight is the view of culture. So whereas in cultural competence, you're looking at just the group traits, with cultural humility, you're allowing for that individual uniqueness. So how that individual fits into the culture, identifies with the culture, maybe not as much as we might think. So people get to be people, and they get to be more than just that group that they may be a part of. The second part I'd like to highlight is around traditions. So from the cultural competent perspective, we would think that immigrants and minorities are the ones that follow traditions. Whereas from a cultural humility perspective, everyone follows traditions. And so to share just a personal experience around traditions, I had a friend that spent Thanksgiving with me and my family. And we were eating stuffing, and in my mind, it's not Thanksgiving without stuffing or dressing. And the person shared with me how foreign the concept, there was no stuffing where they came from. And, one of the other things that seeing it from their perspective helped me realize is, I never really saw Thanksgiving as an American holiday, but then I saw, oh, right, it is something that is, ingrained with the history of this country. And stuffing is kind of a weird food when I think about it from someone else's perspective. So we all have traditions. If you want to screenshot this, if you find it helpful or useful, feel free to do so. But as I mentioned, it's not in your original slide deck. Finally, so this is my challenge and my encouragement to you, is to expand how you think about culture and how you think about others different from yourselves, from a framework of cultural competence to a framework of cultural humility. And some would argue to kind of replace cultural humility with cultural competence. I don't agree with that. I think there's a lot of value to cultural competence, to learning about other groups, other cultures, other perspectives. And what I would say is it could be more of a progressive thing where, you have that knowledge and you can use it to inform an experience, but that experience or that individual that you're interacting with should not be limited by, that information that you have. Okay, so the part that you've all been waiting for, now that you have a little bit of a foundational knowledge that may have just supplemented what you already knew, how what you can do with that knowledge, or what you can do kind of actionable to influence your team or improve your team. Okay, so we're going to talk about 5 of these skills. And this is where I'm really going to delve into a little bit more of the experiential component. So not just behaviors and thoughts, but that experience. So not to just listen, but to really hear, to facilitate as much transparency as possible, to take risks, all for the sake of corrective experiences, to practice cultural humility, and to create time and space. So active listening versus hearing. So active listening you might be very familiar with, and this is whenever you're in some kind of training about communication. Listening is an essential component, and that's where you're going to learn about like the different behaviors about eye contact and nodding your head, and reflective listening, reflecting back what the other person is saying. And my encouragement is to move beyond listening to actually hearing. And the difference is when you're hearing, the goal is to really understand what the person is saying and where the person is coming from. So what that's going to involve is a little bit more of that emotional component where you're kind of slowing down and you're taking the time to really get what the person is saying. And how do you know if you're understanding the person? It's going to be based on their experience because they feel understood. If they're not feeling understood, I would encourage you to kind of stay with that conversation and work with that process so that they could feel understood. With this, I do want to add a caveat that I'm not going to say, take as much time that it takes, because there could be reasons sometimes where understanding may not be happening in an interaction. So I just want to acknowledge there might be, specific instances where we might not apply this, but most times I would encourage to really attempt to understand someone, especially if they're different from you. This is from a LinkedIn video where Oprah was interviewed by the CEO of LinkedIn, Jeff Weiner. And what he was asking her, he was commenting saying that, you don't really use note cards when you interview people. And why is that? And Oprah said, she really wants to fully hear the person. She wants to hear them. And so what that means is she didn't really allow for other things to kind of take her attention away from what the person's saying, but she's really fully present, fully engaging in that moment. And we see just from Oprah's life or history, the outcomes when you really take the time to hear people, what can become of that. All right, so this is about corrective experiences. Corrective experiences, I'm borrowing a little bit of this from psychology. And what it is, I talked earlier about trust and how our disposition to trust is informed by some of our history, as well as some of the groups or the bias that we engage in. It's based on some of the past experiences that we've had with those groups. And so corrective experiences really provides an opportunity for someone to have an experience that's different than their past. So this is going to work on two sides. It can be the individual. So for example, if I'm someone who maybe I tend to not be very trusting of people, then I'm going to give myself that opportunity to change that behavior. And what that's going to mean is taking a risk. So where maybe I would join a new team and I wouldn't really be quick to trust people, or not wanting to trust people, or even just having super, super firm boundaries and thinking, hey, when I leave work, that's it. I don't want anything to do with the people that I work with. But kind of stepping out and, being willing to try to trust someone a little bit more than maybe what you typically would do. So I wouldn't say go from 0 to 10. I'm saying 0 to 1, being willing to change that story, to give yourself an opportunity to have a corrective experience. The other way that could work is if you're someone and you want to provide a corrective experience for someone else. So maybe they've only, I guess if I gave an example, I'll use the example that I shared my story at the beginning, where I'm in business school. And the people that I was interacting with, they were not used to interacting with someone like me. And in their worlds, emotion really didn't have a place. And they, admitted that they just didn't really know how to interact in certain ways. And so, I had an opportunity to let them interact with someone that they just weren't used to, or a group or a demographic or whatever the case may be, where they can now learn that, oh, this is how it is. This is how it could work. This is how it could be a positive experience. And thereby they have that new learning experience. So again, that's that corrective experience. And over time, people actually learn and actually are able to change as they take these risks and embrace the discomfort that comes when you're doing something unfamiliar. Third is allowing time and space. So again, when you're working with people different from you, people think differently. People process information differently. People engage in groups differently. And sometimes when we're in such a rush to, make a decision or get the meeting over or go down the agenda, we're not allowing for the different ways that people engage and that people process information. So what I would encourage is to allow time for that process. And I put a note there about not at the expense of productivity, because sometimes people will think that, oh, well, if I allow this space or time to process, we're never going to make a decision, or, it's just going to go on and on and on. And again, that's talking about the zeros and the ones and the extremes. So we're talking about allowing for, the room and making space for the process. I think I've heard a phrase, take space, make space. From a student, but it's a beautiful phrase once I heard it, because it's important to allow that space. And that's where some of the process really, really happens. And where, we talked very, very briefly about the psychological safety, but where you can make that space for that it can feel safe for someone can speak up in that space, in that silence. Get comfortable with silence. That's a free tip. Okay, cultural humility, we talked about this a little bit, but embracing that and acknowledging yourself in the relationship. One of the other components that comes with cultural humility is about being aware of the power imbalances and holding systems accountable. So it's a very active process. Again, it's not like something where you just arrive at it and all of a sudden you're competent, but it's very much a process. So I'd love to share a brief story about a workshop that I attended, and it had to do with diversity and intersecting identities for females. But she shared an activity, and the activity, it had a lot of different ways that people were diverse. And she said, okay, think about 2 areas of diversity that you think about all the time. And then she said, think about 2 areas of diversity that you never think about. And that was a huge aha moment for me, because the ones that I never think about, for some, those were areas that others think about all the time. And so I realized, privilege is one of those things where we all have some type of privilege and we may not even be aware of it. But, it's one of those things where you don't really ask for it. It just kind of is, and you can use it for good. And so sometimes I hear people that have certain levels of privilege that they're very much aware of, and they're very embarrassed and ashamed about it. But I would, from my experience, to me, it was like, oh, Catherine, you also have areas of privilege, and how can you use the areas or the access or, whatever you have to help others. Okay, and the final one is facilitating transparency. Again, we all have histories, we all have experiences, and when there's information that's lacking, we will make things up, we will fill in the blanks. If we're talking about creating teams where there can be trust, where there can be safety, we want to try to be as transparent and as honest as possible. Again, the caveat is, I get that, you can't always share everything, but just to do your best. Any Brene Brown fans out there know she'll talk about vulnerability, and, authenticity is a thing now. And, so again, I'd encourage to just be as transparent as possible. All right, so last thing is our one thing discussion. And Maya's letting me know that we have a lot of hands raised. So let me think of checking our time, seeing how we're doing on time. All right. Before I go to the one thing, I am going to maybe see what is on people's minds, and then we'll wrap up with this last one discussion, and then we'll jump into more Q&A. Let me just check in with Maya. Maya, would it be better to wait for the Q&A part, or are there things that
Sorry. So those hands, sorry about that. Those hands were for the last question. So we can just continue as we were, and then after this, jump into Q&A.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much, Maya. Okay. So this is our last question, our one thing question. So here are the 5 skills that we talked about. And what I would like you to reflect on is, what is one thing that you can do differently to grow one of the skills that we discussed today? So this is you just thinking about your own team and your own behaviors, what you know about them, how people respond, experiences you've had, and just one thing you can do. So go ahead and just think about that. And I would love to hear a few thoughts. Give you a few seconds, and then please do go ahead and raise your blue hands. If you had your blue hand up before, you can go ahead and put it down, unless you would like to speak to this, and then in that case, you can keep it up. Okay, so I would love to hear from those that would like to share about the one thing that they can do differently to move forward.
Hi, my name is Courtney. I'm looking at the be transparent, and I'm looking back to what we were talking about in diversity and how conflict is good. And I think that sometimes I have a hard time if I don't agree with someone or I have a different opinion in a meeting, it's kind of getting my point across. I think sometimes I get worried about that conflict and not wanting to disagree with other people. So I think really being open and finding a way to express myself that doesn't come off as, I don't agree with you, you're wrong, but more, this is my opinion, this is what I think, and, coming up with a solution that probably would, fit both parties and come up with something that, in the end of the day, probably would be collaborating, coming up with a better solution.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. That's absolutely wonderful, and I appreciate you sharing also about, just having different experiences, but not necessarily wanting it to cause any kind of friction. One of a good tool for that is when you share, and I'm not necessarily saying this, to you, but just as a general tip, is sharing from your experience works really well because no one can argue with your experience. And so you can start a sentence by saying, my experience has been, or, in my experience. And so we're not saying, if I can leave you with anything, is like, most of the world, when it comes to humans and people, exists between zeros and ones, and that there's infinite options. And so it doesn't have to be your experience or my experience. It could be, you have an experience and I have an experience, and they both are valid. So that's just, what a good little tip to be able to share your experience, which is valid, without it necessarily having to invalidate someone else's experience or perspective. Others that are open to sharing.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I wanted to speak kind of to both being transparent and practicing cultural humility, because I think for me, what's coming up is, like, I find myself internally resistant to publicly acknowledging when I don't know something, and kind of being like, I don't understand something, or I don't know something. And I don't know if other folks can relate to that. But I think in that context, the cultural humility and being transparent are connected. And I think it would definitely be helpful for my team and potentially for other teams for us to feel, to trust that we can make ourselves vulnerable and acknowledge that we, don't know something, don't understand something, and that we need other people's input or help to get there. So that's something that came up for me.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing. That's an excellent point. And that's another reason why I like the cultural humility component versus the cultural competence, because it really relieves you of the weight of having to know everything. And so you're absolutely right? The transparency and the humility go together, because it's in that you're asking someone, you can say, I'm not familiar, and can you share your experience? So it's absolutely perfect, and it gives you permission to not have to know and to ask that person to elaborate or share their experience. And it lets them have an experience, right? You are not going to assume that their experience is the same as the whole group's experience. So maybe let's see how we're doing on time. I think it's time to go into our Q&A portion. So thank you everyone who were open to sharing in the discussion portions. Last poll, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it that you will do the action that you stated? Maya, if you don't mind briefly initiating that poll, just kind of say on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you going to do the actual action that you said that you do? I'm loving what I'm seeing. And thank you for those that are being very honest. I love this. So right now I've got over 80%. Can't speak too quickly. The numbers keep changing. Okay. And for the sake of time, I would love to ask a follow-up question, but I'm not going to be able to. But what I love to ask when people are rating things like this, like for example, the people that chose a 7, I'd be very curious about why a 7 and not a 6. So that kind of lets me know that you're wanting to do something, but maybe there's something that might be getting in the way a little bit. So for the sake of time, I can't delve into that part, but something to be thoughtful of. All right, so we're done with this. I'm going to wrap this up, and then we can jump into our Q&A portion. Last thing I'm going to leave you with is every part matters. This is a deconstructed Audi 8, and all these are actual little pieces of the car. And when it's together and when it's functioning well and normally, you might not even realize all of the components and all of the parts that help to make it what it is. But every single part, whether it's visible or not visible, matters. So this is the visual I'm going to leave you with. I would love to stay in touch with you all if you feel so motivated. Just launched a podcast. Authentic Work is what it's called. If you're into that kind of stuff, you can check it out on Spotify or also on my website, teamingstrategy.com. And if you're into Instagram, I jumped on that. So feel free to reach out and let's stay connected. So with that, we can conclude this portion, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
So we have quite a few questions in the chat. Firstly, I do want to apologize to everyone for the minimal technical difficulties that we had with the feedback form. And I appreciate, the raffle form, and I appreciate everyone who chatted me assisting and trying to assist and help. But we do have quite a few questions for the Q&A. Let's start with the first one. How do you allow yourself to build trust with a team that is clearly very trustworthy after having very poor, hostile team experiences before them?
That's a beautiful question. Okay, so if I'm understanding, then we're on a team, and the team is trustworthy, but past experiences have shown that you've had different experiences in the past. Okay, so this is where, and I'll just kind of keep this thing up, where I can maybe reference a few of the skills as we go through it. Okay, there we go. Okay, so this is where we'd be talking about the corrective experiences. And if you're saying that, because here's one of the things that happens, right? Like if nothing changes, nothing changes. So what that means is that if we want something to change or we want different outcomes than what we've had before, then we need to do something different. And so that's where, you might take steps that you may not have taken before. And I'm sorry, I'm having two thoughts at the same time. And so if I'm thinking about it, we're not talking about just random past experiences. We're talking about you just had a bad experience and you're kind of coming out of that, and it's taking time to kind of come into this new experience. So there's a couple of components, and without talking to you directly, it really depends on a couple of different things. First of all, I wouldn't rush the process. I wouldn't rush it. Sometimes, depending on the experience and how intense it is, it could be a traumatic experience, and it might just take time. So first thing I would say is some self-compassion and empathy for yourself, and give yourself time and don't rush it. And as you're giving yourself that time, you can reflect on the past experiences and reflect on the specific components that made it challenging, and kind of learning from that. What could you have done differently? Because I talked about how a lot of times we're looking at what do we have control over, what don't we have control over, and a lot of times what we have the most amount of control over is ourselves. And so a part of it sometimes is, okay, how could I have responded differently to that situation? And so as you're reflecting on those things and you're doing your own learning and your own growth, then you can be ready to engage in this new team or this new trusting team in a different way. But again, it doesn't have to be a all in, they're trustworthy, let's just, bare my heart, but just kind of taking your time with that. I hope that answers your question.
Next question. If you feel marginalized on your team, can you recommend psychological tools that will help increase your comfort within the group without always making yourself an other?
Okay, so if you're feeling marginalized in the group, tools that you can do to help yourself in the group. One of the things I would do, and maybe this also speaks a little bit to my own experience, and what I'm a huge fan of is, so I'm a fan of mindfulness. Basically what mindfulness is it's a practice, but it's a practice of building a skill of being able to be present and aware in the moment. And so what I would encourage you to do is kind of really focusing in on, okay, the moment. So when something's happening and what it is that you're feeling, or what it is that's contributing to that experience. So when you say marginalized, like really being able to like tease that out, like, okay, what is it that I'm experiencing? What's going on? What is it specifically within the team that's having this impact on me? So teasing that apart a little bit. And then when you think about, one thing that's important to do is separating out impact, but we're also separating out behaviors. So what specific things are happening on the team that's having this impact on me? And then kind of taking the steps to have whatever conversations that are necessary to help improve that. But again, how you talk about it is really important. Validating your experience is totally valid, and kind of saying, okay, how can I interact with my own experience and with this situation and with this team to have a different outcome and to be more effective?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get the team to appreciate and utilize the diversity, not dismiss or ignore?
Excellent question. I will pull from my own experience, as well as some of the tools, or some of the literature that we talked about today. So, I'm very empathetic towards humans in general. Most humans are good. Sometimes people just don't know. They haven't had that experience. And so, for example, how I shared where my team was not leveraging our diversity, and they just were so unfamiliar with so many different parts. And so part of what I was doing in the process when I made that choice to engage is, okay, I'm having to build trust with them. helping them to trust me. And so, for example, I talked about the integrity part of it. So when I said I was going to do something, I did it. And that just kind of helped them, build trust with me. The other thing that I did a lot of was a lot of communicating and talking and sharing my experience and sharing my perspective. Again, trying to do it in the most effective way possible, talking about, my experience, the impact something's having on me. The other thing that I did, and again, I've heard it in other presentations today, and I would reiterate this anyways, which is your voice matters, and, to speak. And it's okay if it's not perfect. Anytime you're learning any new skill, it's a change process. And so it gets easier the more you do it. But at the beginning, it could be a little tough. But to speak up and to speak. And so I mentioned how everything was so rushed and there wasn't room to speak. And so I kind of had to figure out how to get heard in this culture. It was a new culture for me, how to get heard in this culture. So I'm trying to remember. Maya, can you read the question back one more time? I want to make sure I'm answering that question.
Yes. How do you get the team to appreciate and utilize the diversity, not dismiss or ignore?
Okay, yeah. So that's the thing. So the biggest thing, I guess, if I could just summarize all of the things that I was saying, is that communication component. So the communication being verbal, and then also the communication being in your actions and how you're engaging with the team and how you're acknowledging that, okay, if I want to build trust here between, them and myself, what are some things that I can do to show, and provide that corrective experience for them. So you're kind of making a way and crafting a path. It's going to depend on your team, but it's very much, approaching and figuring it out and figuring out what works. Do more of what works and do less of what doesn't work.
Next question. If you could teach Cal students one thing that would make them better leaders, what would it be?
Oh, I love that question. I'll tell you. Okay. I love that question. I don't know why. I would say better leaders, I would say paying attention to your experience. And so by experience, that's what I'm talking about, like the emotions and that internal experience. I look at it like an engine light, in that it comes on to communicate something to you. So it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just something that's there and it's communicating some valuable information. And so many times we just ignore it or invalidate it, or we don't find value in it because we can't see it. But I think we have abilities to kind of pick up on things, or, that's different than our five senses. And that's something that's communicating something valuable. So I would say learn what that's communicating to you, and not to underestimate it. But I think that's a beautiful part that we all have, and it's very valuable, and I think it's a hidden secret.
Can you provide some tips or a little more general advice about how to apply some of these skills to team meetings or interactions when you're not the team leader, supervisor, project manager, and the person that controls the meetings?
Okay, so general ways to apply it when you are not the person that's running the meeting. I'd be curious what that experience of that meeting is. Let me just think.
Follow up, very agenda or reporting based.
Okay. I think if I had to think about a tool, I would probably use questions. Okay, so let me bring in the Berkeley take space, make space. So first of all, if you're going to say something, be okay taking that space and taking that time. Don't I don't want to say don't feel rushed. You might feel it, but in terms of your actions, don't be rushed. Just take your time. And I would say ask questions. So, you can raise your hand and ask a question, but a question that's an open-ended question that doesn't have a yes or no answer, but can really slow things down and can open things up. So something like, can you say more about this? What do you mean when you mentioned this? I'm curious about this other component. Can we talk about it a little bit more? Or even if you're asking a question like, I would really appreciate having more time to talk about this. Is it possible to have, I don't know, another meeting where we can have more time to talk about this one thing? Not that question, because that's a yes or no. How can we have another meeting when we can talk about more about this one thing? So I would stay away from yes or no's and just start asking questions. And I find questions are a nice way to really change things. Sometimes you can feel like a tone or atmosphere in a meeting, especially if it's going somewhere that's unproductive or unhelpful. A well-placed, thoughtful question can really change that component, and it can also slow things down. So that's the thing I'd recommend.
As someone who tends to operate in zeros and ones when it comes to trust, either I am coming in with great distrust of others, or I am too trusting and sometimes come off as too forward. What can I do to calibrate more towards a healthier, balanced approach?
Yeah, great question. I think of things, so we're talking about zeros and ones. And so when we need to create more variability, I'll put things in different little diagrams, but for your specific question, I would put it on like a bullseye diagram. And so what that's going to do is that's going to give us like a gradient. So we could say like, too much trust would, like if you're in the middle of the bullseye as a person, too much trust that other, person's right in the middle with you, versus no trust if it's a bullseye and there's different rings. Like no trust would be you're on the outside and that's where you stay. And so I kind of do that gradient, and then you can move people along that gradient. So we can say, okay, maybe I can give you a lot of trust, but not too much trust. And so maybe 1 ring out or 2 rings out. People that you might need to have firm boundaries with, 3 rings out, 4 rings out. So just kind of create something like that. And you can put people in different places along those rings, and people can move. So again, we were talking about the knowledge-based trust. And as we're learning more about people and they are, I don't want to use the word trustworthy, but that's pretty much what we're assessing. We can kind of bring them a little bit closer, or, again, set firmer boundaries if we need to. But again, just kind of go with the gradient part. And it's a learning process. So start somewhere and then just keep growing as you practice and test it out.
So this is a question that came up as you mentioned authenticity. In my experience and other Black women's experiences, we found that many of us did not feel safe bringing our full selves to work, especially in a traditional work setting. Can you speak to ways to taking the steps to do that?
I love your questions. Just like, let's just put it out there. But this is real life, right? So that's what we're talking about. And that's real. And that happens for a reason. The safety is a really good point, because, a lot of what our behaviors are learned. And so we may have done things where like, I did not get a good outcome with this. It's not safe. I need to step back or pull this back. There's no place for this here. And, so I'd say part of it is a little bit of what this is about is kind of being okay with who you are and learning how to let more and more of it show up, and influencing the environment at the same time. Because what happens is, when the environment doesn't really make space for it, and so therefore you choose to just adapt to the environment, you lose, and the environment kind of loses, because that just means there's parts that you're able to contribute that now you're not able to, because it doesn't really feel like there's space for it. And so I would say just kind of, maybe if I'm thinking about a gradient approach, just allowing a little bit more and a little bit more. If there are places where it is safe, of course, bringing it there. Maybe influencing the environment a little bit to help facilitate safety. So that could look very different depending on your environment. It could look like one-to-one conversations with people, who have the ability to help change the environment or help change the culture. From a change management perspective, you can think about like advocates or people that might be within a certain environment or within a certain culture that have influence or that have power. And speaking maybe individually about that person and that person becoming an ally, and maybe there might be things that they can do to help facilitate some kind of safety. So it's a multi-pronged approach where you're making adjustments and allowing that and being okay with that and validating that, and kind of partnering with other people that have some kind of ability to influence the culture. But it's something where not acting is, you know, depending on where you are. I'm going to speak from my own experience, but for me, it got to a point where things wasn't working for me anymore. And so it kind of forced a change. A change has to happen. And so then it became a part of, okay, how can you facilitate change? It just has to happen. So now you have to figure out how. So that's kind of the perspective that I'm coming from, where you're just taking a multi-pronged approach and just, you know, moving along that place. And again, it gets easier the more you do it. It gets easier to be you the more you do it. I can't say that the whole process of facilitating that change gets easier.
What is your thought on meeting people where they are, and how might it help or not help people see your point of view?
I love meeting people where they are. And one of the biggest things that I look for is willingness. And maybe this is, you know, also comes from the cultural humility perspective as well. But if there's a willingness in the other person, then there's room for change. There's room for growth. There's room for a conversation, as long as that other person is willing. So I'm happy to meet people where they are. And I think it's important to meet people where they are. And then if there's willingness, we can move forward. If you're interacting with someone and there's no willingness, it's unlikely that they'll be able to see your perspective. So yeah, looking for that willingness. And the second part, you know, if you're wanting them to see your perspective, I'm going to apply one of these skills here. This don't just listen, but hear. I would engage kind of practicing hearing them, because sometimes what happens in interactions, especially, so let's say, for example, you're in a conversation and maybe there's a defensiveness, or they're not hearing, or there's something that's happening in that moment where like what you're saying is not coming across, it's not being heard. And so being really present in that moment and hearing what they're saying. And when you're able to hear what someone else is saying, it opens up the conversation where they're also kind of hearing what you're saying and where you're coming from. And again, there's room for both. There's room for both perspectives. And so it's not a tug of war. We're like, me, you. It's okay. This is your perspective. This is your experience. That makes sense. That's valid. This is my perspective. This is my experience. Also valid. So the both and approach.
What steps can a team member or leader take to help people feel safe bringing their true selves to work?
I think that, so it comes as a process, and it's a function of learning. So as humans, we're very sensitive creatures, and we're always kind of scanning the environment, and we're scanning the environment for like, is it safe? Is it dangerous? And, you know, sometimes there are things that are done, or there are things that are said that can be interpreted as, okay, it's not really safe to share here. So I would say doing whatever you can to communicate that it is safe. How, like, for example, if someone on the team, you know, takes a risk, or they share something that's a little bit vulnerable, how that leader responds to that other person sharing will matter. And so everyone else is learning from that. Like, oh, okay, it's safe for so-and-so to share. That's called social learning, where we learn from other people's experiences or by observing others. So, you know, it's a process, in that this is going to be something, you know, every single day, every single week, where you're looking for opportunities to model that as you're relating to other team members. And of course, if that person is taking a risk, right, they're looking for a corrective experience, maybe they share something, just a little bit, right? Because we don't know that it's safe. We're just testing the waters. But when they do that, how you respond to that, how you reinforce that. So, and over time, that's where the learning happens. And that's where the experience of, okay, it feels a little bit safer here. There's one more thing I think I wanted to add. Yeah, I would be cautious with just those direct approaches of, this is a safe place. You should share. It's something that's observed and experienced. It's not verbal communication. So it's going to have everything to do with how you are behaving and how people are feeling. And, being in the moment. So this is where I'm talking about like the process moments or like the mindfulness when you see something unfolding or someone's responding defensively, something just happened in that moment, and being okay, kind of just asking, okay, what just happened here? Did I come off a certain way, that maybe wasn't intended, but is having a certain kind of impact. So also paying attention to those moments that are important.
So it looks like we have time for one more question. And this is rather long. It has a backstory. Once I was in a car with 2 directors and 2 staff members. I was the only person of color in the car. One of the directors began a conversation about teachers with accents and then proceeded to state that she once had a teacher that was fresh off the boat. I am sure she was fresh off the boat and had this accent. Everyone had problems understanding her. If you were in my position, what would have been your response? Keep in mind, this person is my direct supervisor and the leader of the team.
Okay. And Maya, can I have you read a part of the question before? Like, okay, so they were in the car, and the comment part, like what was the comment that was being made?
That the teacher or person speaking was fresh off of the boat, and they had a harsh accent, and everyone had problems understanding her. Okay. The conversation was about teachers with accents.
And so I guess I can make the assumption that it wasn't like a neutral conversation and just like, this is an observation that we made.
Yes.
But more so, it's a problem that this person has an accent, and maybe also some of the language of, the fresh off the boat kind of language. And so I'm having to infer, since I can't really ask for clarification, but it sounds like part of what was happening in that moment is that the way someone's being talked about or characterized it's not really appropriate. It's not respectful. It's kind of what it sounds like. And so, in answering your question, right, I'm putting myself in this situation, which is, I think, what you're asking me to do. If you were in the situation, how would you respond? And so with that, it's important, like I'm having to acknowledge the emotion of it, like, okay, this feels really uncomfortable, and I'm hearing this thing being said, and it's not okay, and there's a power differential. And you're in a car with people of differing degrees of leadership. So there's all of those factors that are in play, which is why the answer is not going to be a black and white answer. And there's a huge risk involved, So depending on, it's going to depend on so many different things. This is where I would say, right, like I'm really engaging that like internal, radar to get a sense of, okay, what's the right thing to do in this situation for me? Sometimes something needs to happen, and it doesn't always mean that, I'm the one to do it, or I'm the one to do it right now. And sometimes like, no, now is the time for me to do it, and I'm the one to say something. So I tap into that and kind of use wisdom to figure out what's the right course of action there. It would probably, if I needed to do something and I knew I needed to do something, it would probably be a conversation. It probably wouldn't be in that moment, because that could probably cause more problems. And so that's kind of what I could say at this point with the information that I have at the time right now. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up the Q&As. Thank you everyone for all of your questions, for your attention, and for your interest.
Dr. Ciano, thank you so much. That was a fantastic presentation. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to attend our virtual Now conference, which has been UC Berkeley's first full virtual conference. We've had 1,200 attendees, and so I'm very, very appreciative of the time that you guys took to participate. Thank you all for attending. You guys have a wonderful afternoon. See ya.